Here we go. Chapter 10.4, Sustaining Terrestrial Biodiversity and their Ecosystem Services. Simply put, we need to create areas that are protected from human activities. Currently, 94% of the planet is reserved for human use. Well, we get that number because only 6% has actually been set aside, actively preserved, not for human use. We've set it aside as a wilderness area, it's protected. Not much of the land is. So, how do we go about it? Well, there's really, in a sense, 9 points or 9 strategies that we can employ to help sustain this terrestrial biodiversity. Remember, the greater the biodiversity, the healthier an area, or the healthier the planet is, and a healthy planet sustains life for us all. So, number 1, we want to protect species from extinction, because we know from food webs, food chains, that one thing goes out and it has a grand effect. We need to set aside wilderness areas. There's only 13% of land set aside as wilderness, but a lot of this wilderness areas is still designed for humans to go in and camp, etc. Humans are not completely off of it, or we mine in it some other things. So that's the discrepancy between 13% is wilderness area and only 6%. Because a lot of these wilderness areas, we're still not completely protected. We're doing something on them. Third, we should establish parks and nature preserves where people can interact with nature. We need to have some places where we can go out and be in it so that we can protect others. Once again, if you remove all of it, it doesn't work so well. 4, we need to identify and protect biodiversity hot spots, these areas where we have lots of different life, like rainforest or coral reefs, just a real quick one. Shift new developments to lands that are already cleared or degraded. A lot of times we're going into brand new areas. Well, let's set up things where we've already cleared it out, especially if we're talking about businesses, shopping centers, etc. We don't need to take out really nice areas. We need to increase crop productivity on our existing cropland. We need to get our harvest yields higher so we don't just start getting more land. Let's get more productive on the farming land we have as best as we can. We need to rehabilitate and even restore these partially damaged ecosystems. Some of these are not beyond repair, and some of the focus needs to go into that. And we need to learn how to share areas that we as humans dominate with other species. These are 9 key points or 9 strategies that we need to really employ to see this occur. Well, let's talk about wilderness areas specifically. In the United States, in 1964, we passed the Wilderness Act. Here, the U.S. government was given the power, if you will, to set aside undeveloped tracts of public land. So they had it anyway, and they could set aside this will be wilderness area. But less than 5% of U.S. land is actually protected as wilderness. 54% of that land is in Alaska alone. There's only about 2.5% or even less percent in the lower 48 states that is actually protected wilderness land. Not very much. As our human population and our ecological footprint, remember, affluence has its own problems. We tend to consume more resources. But as this economic footprint expands, it gets increasingly difficult to establish new wilderness areas. We need to do it now while we still have some, because as we expand out, the government can only do it on lands they already own. Currently, only 6% of land worldwide is set apart for non-human use. In other words, true wilderness. That we're not supposed to mine on it, we're not supposed to log on it, we're not supposed to go in and camp it, that it's actually set aside. Very little sets of lands are actually done in that way. Here we're taking a look at some caribou as they are migrating across in one of these actual protected areas up in Alaska. But once again, these areas are kind of far and few between. Now, outside of wilderness areas, we also have parks and nature reserves. Now, in 120 countries worldwide, there are over 6,500 of these national parks. Unfortunately, most of them are too small to actually sustain large animal species. Think of something like here in Gainesville, like the millhopper. It really is a pretty small area, and we have some deer and fox and things of that nature, but it's too small for bear, for mountain lion, cougar, puma, or the jaguar, something of that nature here. So a lot of them are just too small for that. And some are so popular that the human use is actually degrading it. Even though it's a park and a nature preserve, the trails and so many people coming in or driving cars in it, it's still getting degraded because of the increased human population and more people wanting to go see it. Now, parks in less developed countries tend to have the greatest diversity. Unfortunately, in a lot of those, the countries don't have the resources or the finances to keep the illegal poaching, the illegal logging, illegal mining, along with some other uses. So the area is set aside, and it's great biodiversity, but people just go in all the time and steal, if you will, the resources that it's supposed to be protecting. If they don't have the resources and the manpower to go after it, people will go get what they can. Once again, common use, it's everybody, so it's in my best interest to take everything I can. It tends to degrade it. We've got to lose that idea. Now, stresses on U.S. public parks. There are quite a few case studies in this chapter. Remember, case studies are a great go-to when you need a case in point. When you're writing an FRQ, you can use one of these case studies as here is a point. The United States, we have 59 national parks. However, these are the things that tend to degrade them. Popularity, the more popular the park is, the more people want to go to it, and we get. Picture I have back here is one of those such parks. Beautiful, the mountains in the back and this gorgeous lake and the beachside, and it attracts a lot of people. Human use tends to degrade it over time. In a lot of these parks, we allow like off-road vehicle use. So people go out there four-wheeling, what have you. Obviously, that's damaging trails, structure, the pollution that's going in, noise pollution, driving animals out. Cell phone towers going up into many of them, which really can kind of ruin the scenery, especially if you're wanting to go to a park like this, and all of a sudden, there's a big cell phone tower there. Non-native species get introduced to these, once again, whether some of it's coming from domestic or we brought the pigs in, like the 1912, 1920s, we brought European hogs in, let them loose out so we could have them for hunting, and they're still there today. And the feral hog problem's a pretty big problem, specifically more in the South, but also even into California. And just nearby air pollution and traffic. I go wilderness camping out on the Suwannee and the Santa Fe rivers, and usually when we set up and want to camp on the side of the river, we want it to be peaceful and quiet. And a lot of times we stop, I can still hear the car traffic. So just that noise pollution really drives a lot of things away, degrades on what it should be. And just overdue maintenance and repairs. A lot of our parks are not funded real well, even in the United States, and many of them need some very much needed repairs, maintenance, and a lot of times it's just not happening. So even in a country of the affluence like the United States, maintenance and repairs can still be an issue. Another case study, looking at reintroducing the gray wolf into Yellowstone National Park. Well, the number of gray wolves declined dramatically between 1850 and 1900. 1776, we become a country, if you will. We've already had people here for 100 years. We're moving out more west, and the gray wolves were really seen as a problem. They were a predator and would kill livestock or small children even going out, and we hunted them almost to extinction. We either shot them, we trapped them, we poisoned them. Once again, we might use their fur for something, but for the most part, we saw them as a pest, something to get rid of. In 1996, we relocated 41 gray wolves back into Yellowstone. We actually caught them up in Canada, had permission, all that, brought them down into Yellowstone and re-released them in because we felt that they would really help. Along the riverbanks, a lot of the trees that normally were growing were being stripped and killed off because the elk population had grown so high. No natural predators. The coyote population had grown real high, and the coyotes were actually giving a problem to the nearby ranchers because they would kill sheep and whatever. Wolves were brought in. They're really a keystone species. They do a lot for it. They'll leave part of the kill, and then bald eagles come in, and we really felt that they would wind up being an overall good impact. They have decreased the elk population, but of course, anytime we introduce something else, the coyote population has gone down, and we're seeing other effects. And it's really currently an ongoing in the wild science experiment to determine what it should be. We estimate that somewhere between 104 and 150 wolves in the Yellowstone area should be a healthy, thriving population, and we're getting close to that, and we're monitoring closely to see if this is going to be as a success or if the animals and plants had already changed so much that reintroducing it is actually causing a problem. Sometimes it's hard to know what the best solution is. Now, large nature preserves, sometimes referred to as mega preserves, they typically sustain more species. They provide greater habitat diversity than small reserves. Once again, if we think here in Gainesville, Florida, the Devil's Millhopper area overall is pretty small, and it doesn't harbor a lot of kind of special or specific wildlife in it, but the really large ones can. Once again, it's all protected. You don't have homes, houses, people hunting, etc. And these large habitats provide corridors that can really benefit species. It allows them to migrate. So if there is any kind of climate change, the areas are big enough that they can move to an area that they fit into. Also, in a lot of these parks, we want to add in what we call a buffer zone. When I lived in Nepal, there was an area called the Bardia National Forest, protected area, and inside of that it had tigers, it had elephants, it had water buffalo. I don't think they had rhino, but deer population, monkeys, it was all there. But it was in this protected area. Around it was a buffer zone where some of the native people could live and farm and work in this buffer zone, but it kept industry out of it and more industrialized areas away. So you could have industrialization up to here, then you had this buffer zone around it where people lived more indigenous type peoples, farming and agricultural based, and that provided a buffer zone to the actual forest. That's what I mean by this buffer zone concept. We're trying to protect that inner core, so we allow some things to happen here, but full-on humanity, if you will, can only exist outside of the buffer zone to try and keep our core bioprotected so that we have as much biodiversity as possible. So we're trying to do sustainable resource extraction. We may be taking some trees, some stuff, but sustainable, protecting the core. So we'll talk about buffer zones in a lot of cases. Now in the picture we have up here, we're looking at some of these mega preserves in Costa Rica. So the green areas inside are the actual national parkland. So that's the protected. But this yellow area is a buffer zone. Only sustainable practices are allowed in the buffer zone to protect, once again, that inner core. Now, Costa Rica, these are designed to sustain about 80% of the country's biodiversity. They feel within Costa Rica, these are the protected areas. They can protect up to 80% in these specific areas. And these protected cores are what they're really hoping to preserve. This also attracts a large ecotourism industry. Lots of people go on eco trips. They want to see the natural stuff. They want to see the wild animals in these areas, which provides a boom to their economy. So a lot of times we can do these with a win-win situation, which is one of those ideas in politics that we're after. We want win-win situations. Now, let's look at, when we talk about sustaining terrestrial biodiversity, let's look at an ecosystem approach. Well, to do an ecosystem approach, we want to say, here's an ecosystem we really need to protect. Well, we got to map them. We need to know where the world's terrestrial ecosystems are so that we can create an inventory of the species there. We need to know where it is so we know what and what's there to know what to protect. We also want to identify specifically the very resilient ones, the ones that have easy time coming back, and the ones that are very fragile. Once again, the ones that are resilient, well, we can have more activities. The ones that are very fragile, we may need to have more of that core with a buffer zone around it. We want to protect the most endangered of these ecosystems and the species within them, with an emphasis on protecting the plant biodiversity and the ecosystem services that they provide. Once again, every biome is really dictated by the plants that live there. We protect the plants, and in turn, they will feed the animals and house and provide everything else along with them. We need to restore the degraded ecosystems. In part of this mapping and identifying is it resilient or fragile, we need to go into the ones that we can and restore them. A lot of times, we just need to allow secondary succession to do its thing. We may need to remove some certain species. We may need to make sure we reintroduce, say, like the gray wolf into Yellowstone, but overall, help restore some of these that are degraded. We need to provide incentives to landowners. Instead of it just being common, let's provide some private use, give some incentive. Landowners that are contributing to it, landowners that are helping restore the forest, landowners that are planting trees. In some shape, form, or fashion, you need to provide incentives to give them a reason to go after it. It's not always enough to say, hey, it'd be really nice if you did. We need to give them solid reasons, economical reasons to go after it and make a difference. Also, we need to protect these hot spots. The map I have up here, those red spots, these are the diversity hot spots. There's 34 of them. We refer to them as biodiversity hot spots around the world. They only cover about 2% of the Earth's surface, but they're the home of most of the endangered species, why we refer to them as the hot spots. It's only 2% of the land, but it is the majority of our endangered species. Take a look, they're almost all near oceans. I wonder why. 1.2 billion people happen to live in these hotspot areas where endangered animals are, but only about 5% of the total area of these hotspots is actually protected. So it's 2% of the Earth, not that much, but of that area, out of 100% of that area, only 5% of the areas within these hotspots wind up being set aside as some kind of national park, wilderness area, etc. 95% of it is just, full-on human habitation. And once again, whenever we have humans in close proximity with lots of animals, humans tend to win that fight every time. We tend to drive things out. Now, another case study, we're going to look at Madagascar. When we look at the pictures up here, now Madagascar is like the fourth largest island, like Australia being the largest continent size, but the fourth largest island. About 90% of the species found in Madagascar are exclusive to Madagascar. They're nowhere else on the planet except for there. But right now, Madagascar is going under severe habitat loss. So looking at a couple of these up here, that funky looking tree, that kind of bottle-shaped tree, is a baobab tree. Well, it can store water in that trunk area for the dry seasons, but it is unique to Madagascar. We don't find it anywhere else. Right beside the tree there, we have the dancing lemur. A lot of lemurs on Madagascar, and once again, many of them, that's the only place we find them in the world outside of some zoos that we might go visit. But Madagascar, once again, is under severe habitat loss because population growth. They have had massive population growth in the past 20, 30 years, and this rapid population growth is leading to most of the habitat loss. And once again, this tends to be true of less developed countries. They tend to have higher population growth, more people using more resources, and it goes normally hand in hand with habitat loss because as they need more land to farm, agricultural societies. We need to identify some of these highly stressed life raft ecosystems. Now what we mean by life raft, the ship's going down, we're jumping on this life raft, this one little area. Now these would be areas that tend to have high poverty. Most people depend on the ecosystem services for survival. They need the trees for fuel to cook their food. They need the animals that are in there to hunt, to eat from. So these are typically high poverty areas. People are 100% dependent on the ecosystem services of the forest, of the land, etc. The residents, public officials, and conservation scientists need to work together in these to come up with these win-win principles. It may be that we can sustain some of it and turn it into ecotourism. Once again, when I talked about Bardia National Forest in Nepal, its ecotourism is one of its biggest draws. It's a wilderness area, but you can go in with guides to hike through on safari, if you will. But ecotourism brings in the money to help them maintain all the equipment within it. So we need to look for more of these win-win situations whenever we're dealing with trying to maintain or sustain ecosystems. We need to restore the damaged ecosystems. There's a lot of restoration examples out there. Replanting of forests. People that go out, there have been a number of philanthropists that have put money into, let's go and reseed forests, plant trees. A lot of tree planting organizations out there trying to reseed, replant our forests. Reintroducing a lot of these keystone species. Once again, going back to the gray wolf, it was a keystone species. It was keeping the elk population down. It was leaving food for a lot of the other scavengers to come by. It kept the coyote population at bay. It was a keystone species, but we drove it out. A lot of times bringing that back in can be very key to an area. We need to remove harmful invasive species. In Florida, we have the air potato plant. I have one that's in my neighbor's backyard that comes onto my fence. I am always beating that thing back. Talk to my neighbor about it, but it's in their yard and I can't go kill it. I just have to hack it down and it makes it into my yard. But we have it all over the place here. Removing these harmful invasive species when at all possible. Sometimes they get so trenched in it's almost impossible, like the boa constrictors in the Everglades. They're kind of here to stay. It's unlikely we're going to get rid of them all at this point. When possible, removing dams. Dams, we're getting hydroelectric from it, however, they are damaging the downstream ecosystems. So actually removing dams, if at all possible, can help restore a lot of these damaged ecosystems. Restoring grasslands. Once again, a lot of times just getting things off of it and let secondary succession do its thing. Coral reefs, a lot of them are in desperate need of restoration. Sometimes we can just keep the tourist away from them because tourists can do a lot of damage with snorkeling, standing on it, breaking them off, etc. The wetlands and stream beds. These are just some of the places that we need to restore and look at for keeping them going. There's really, in a sense, a four-step strategy to restoring these damaged ecosystems. We need to identify the cause of the degradation. Okay, if it's getting destroyed, it's going down, it's getting worse and worse, why? What's causing it? Then we can stop that specific degradation, if at all possible, by eliminating or at least sharply reducing those factors. If we just have too many tourists coming in or too many people going to the park, we can limit the numbers. If we see that logging is going on too close, we can back up. Anyway, identify the problem, then we can try and stop the specific problem. Once again, reintroducing these keystone species like the American alligator. They do a lot for the wetlands by digging the holes where other species can come and collect. And we need to protect it from further degradation. We need to identify what it is, set things up to stop it, and put up policies, regulations in place to protect it from further degradation, getting any worse than it is. We also need to learn to share the ecosystem with other species. We've had this idea that as humans we come in and we drive other things out. We need to learn better to live with things than without. When I lived in India, I never really got used to the monkeys just being out and about in the town. They would come up onto our apartment porch sometimes. Oh my goodness, look at the monkey. But they live more one-to-one with a lot of these animals because they're just out there and part of the society. So this is a reconciliation ecology, if you will. We want to invent and maintain habitats for the species diversity, where people live, work, and play. We don't need to have it always completely separate. A lot of times we can be together. Once again, I have snakes, hawks, all kinds of things that just come into my backyard in my neighborhood. I like the snakes that are in my yards. I know they're eating the mice and other things, but like my next door neighbor, they're terrified of snakes. So sometimes, we just have to come to some sort of equilibrium. They're not really causing me any harm, and there's no problem with us living here together. There's a lot of community-based conservation that you and I can actually do. We can plant gardens in our yards that are good for bees, butterflies, other various pollinators. We try and put some of the type of plants or keep some of the plants in our yard that attract bees, that attract butterflies. And a lot of times that's just an easy choice. I'm going to brighten this plant instead of that plant. We want to reduce our pesticide use. I try not to use pesticides in my yard almost ever. Sometimes we'll spray for mosquitoes, but usually if we have people coming over, we use one of these little chemical things that heats up, keeps them away for now, as opposed to spraying pesticides on everything, which then could hurt the bees and the other things that may come into the yard as well. And provide nesting boxes for birds. Bluebirds are one, especially around Gainesville. We build a lot of houses. We've driven some of the bluebirds out of their natural nesting sites. But we can just put up some bluebird houses, boxes in your neighborhood, and it gives them somewhere to nest. They're not going out because we're there. They'll live where people are. But if we cut down the trees, we get rid of their nesting sites, so we can provide them. There's a lot of things you and I can do just in our community to encourage this, us being with them. We don't need to drive the bluebirds out. We can easily live with them. We don't need to drive bees and all the insects out. They tend to provide a good nurturing of our grass in our yard there. I don't want to get rid of them. A lot of times I need to encourage them. Once again, we try and do things with our mosquitoes, but not by spraying a pesticide. We try and take care of it in different ways. Now, what can you do besides some of these? Well, plant trees. Take care of them. Have trees in your yard. Take an opportunity where there's an initiative where we're going to go out and plant trees. Recycle paper. Recycle everything you can. I know there's a lot of things that we don't always recycle things the best we can, and plastics are just a problem. But glass, aluminum, metals, paper, we tend to recycle these pretty well, and we need to continue doing so. When available or when possible, buy sustainably produced wood. Look for the seal of the FSA on it. Wood and wood products, furniture that's built with it, and get recycled plastic furniture. Decking. When we go to put like planks on for a deck or outside of our house, well, they're making a lot of those out of plastic now. So putting the plastic down, it doesn't rot, it stays. Once again, I don't want my deck to rot. So using some of these recycled plastics can actually be helpful. Find a way to use the recycled stuff. Help restore a forest. Go out on a project where people are getting rid of invasive species, or we're doing something to clear up an area, to take something away, to help something out. Get involved in some shape, form, or fashion, and landscape your yard with native plants. When you go to the store and look, be careful. Are you buying something native to the area? Or are you buying something exotic? Because a lot of times those exotic plants, they might be fine in your yard, but they tend to breed, right? They tend to give off seeds. They tend to give off pollen that goes out and lands somewhere else. And you may well be putting an invasive species in your yard that can get out of your yard and go somewhere else. So put native plants in your yard, if at all possible. And these are just some things that all of us can do to give our little part of the world a chance. That's it, guys, for Chapter 10. Hope you enjoyed it. Take care. We'll see you next time.